All right, ladies and gentlemen of English 231. If you took my class saw me on Monday, a lot of what I say in this video would be something you already have in your notes, but this is something that you could choose to use as a bit of a review of where we discuss the reading of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. The name of this lecture is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and that shady game of exchanges. Here are some things to recall. You're in the middle of your reading of Sir Gawain. Gawain is very loyal to Arthur. He has that quality of being a good knight because he truly is loyal to his liege lord. And he is ready to challenge the Green Knight on behalf of King Arthur to be the king's champion at peril of his own life if necessary, although no one's taking this all very seriously. Um, but one of the questions I asked you to consider is whether he is butch. Is he the toughest guy out there? I submit that you might find that the answer is not so much. He has certain qualities which are not exactly hyper masculine. And first, there's the armor he wears. It's not so much ready for battle as it is for a fancy tournament. And let me explain a bit about tournament culture. Tournament culture in the Middle Ages in Europe was as expensive as Oscar night if Oscar night lasted for a half month. Everybody had to be dressed up. All the nobles would come in their absolute finest finery with their jewels. There would be great feasts and parties and dancing, and then the knights would compete in a jousting match. What you see here are in this image are two people who are jousting each other. Um, uh, the red knight and the green knight do not have sharp points on their lances, which doesn't mean someone couldn't somehow die in a tournament, but this is not warfare. This is a ritualized playing at showing one has the ability to participate in warfare. This is a sport, and it's an amicable sport. And it allegedly was designed to to prepare people for warfare. But there was a concern at the time of Edward III, someone I will talk about, that the warriors were not focusing enough on their jobs as warriors because they were so engaged in tournament culture, which was more like a WWF ritualized SmackDown than it was a true fight to the death, which is what the Hundred Years' War, which was going on at the time, required. Um, Armor used for battle isn't pretty; it's sturdy. Here we see a mannequin in a museum decked out in probably deeply restored medieval armor. Notice that it's not particularly shiny. It isn't brightly colored. There is a cross. There is some painting, perhaps on a shield one could have, but not detailed, because that's going to get rusted off or beaten up anyway. And you want sturdy shoes. You want to have a sword which is sharp, and you want to be able to really protect yourself with the shield. And you want your helmet not to be pretty. I mean, who cares about something like feathers on the top of your helmet? What you want is to be deeply protected. And armor that was used in battle would get beat up. That would be how it would be. And then there was a squire to the knight who would help the knight restore the armor after every waged battle, because it was kind of like if you took I don't know, a tank into battle today. If it were seeing real combat, if it came back, it would probably have some bullet nicks on it, and some other problems that would need to be repaired, ideally, before it went out again to fight another battle. Likewise for armor. But Gawain's armor isn't sturdy. It's pretty. It's got popinjays embroidered on it, and the shield, the Virgin Mary is painted on the shield. Now, an emblem that represented a saint or Jesus or the Virgin Mary, Saint Mary specifically, could be on non-tournament armor, armor for warfare, but it's usually like a cross, like that the knight that we saw there. You could be a crusader with a cross on you, and you'll see that the Templar uniform involves a cross. Um, and of the detailed painting of a Virgin Mary is a good protective saint that you might ask for help in battle. But you probably wouldn't have a beautiful painting of her on the inside of your shield, because that thing is going to get covered in mud and possibly blood, and certainly get nicked up in the battle. And popinjays, um, parrots, exotic birds, were more the stuff of courtly lore, and it was elegant to have something like a brightly colored bird in an image in the Middle Ages, but it was not a guarantee that you would be good in warfare. And very shortly after this, about 150 years, the word popinjay in English for about 300 years becomes synonymous with a man who's kind of foofy and dresses too girly. It's like a guy who's more vain about the way he looks than any woman is a popinjay. In the middle of Shakespeare's time, that word is used that way. Not so here yet officially, but what we see is someone who is, if not crossing gender in dress, certainly crossing the line between battle armor to tournament armor. He goes off to fight the Green Knight in what could be called tournament armor. And then think about this in relation to the kind of prowess that Gawain would have been attributed to have as a knight of the Round Table, and see what they say. And think about what they don't say. Instead of saying, oh my goodness, look at this tough knight. Surely he can fight anybody. We could have a war game to see if he can beat us all. They don't say that in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. That's not what they see when they see Sir Gawain. They say, I think that those who hear him will learn what love talk is. That's on page 312. And if you look at the person who's just left the battlefield of, say, Fallujah, or a really difficult battlefield in Afghanistan, the first thought you might have about their record in war would not be, oh, I bet he's a sweet talker. This indicates that Gawain is suited for court, but he does not appear to other people to be suited for a life of battle and warfare, and the masculinity classically associated with being a knight in shining armor. A man who gives a pretty speech is not necessarily the toughest guy in town. Or I said in the room. Also, there is the matter of the hunting party. Let's talk about the hunt. Here we have a depiction of a medieval hunt. Notice that this has a kind of stylized, idealized forest with what look like rather exotic plants. And you see that there are men on horseback. The dogs are all lunging toward the stag. There are beaters. Beaters are the people who literally beat the stag out of the bushes. They are part of the servant class for the nobles who go on the hunt on horseback. In this time and in this place, if you're on a horse, you are not a peasant. You are not of the servant class. You are, in fact, very likely a noble if you know how to ride, particularly if you know how to ride into a hunt or to battle. And there is a hunting party at the Chateau d'Iselle where Lord Bertilak lives. And some strange things happen about that hunting party. First, normally, when a manly activity happens at a castle, or indeed if you've ever had friends who've had at a party a basketball game where all the guys go out to the court to play basketball together and the women maybe stay in the house with the food or watching a show that the men don't particularly feel like watching, it would be weird not to invite the all the guys to play in the basketball game. Something would have to be wrong with the guy. Maybe he's not a guy that people like. He's kind of a jerk. Well, we know that Gawain is both likable and liked here. That's not a problem. Maybe he's injured. If somebody were in a wheelchair, you wouldn't invite them necessarily to play a game of pickup basketball. Um, but the excuse that's used would probably have been almost an insult for why it was that Gawain wasn't invited. He was tired from his journey. How tired could a knight of the round table really be if he were all that? Um, at a castle, as I said, all the noblemen get invited to participate in the activity together that the men have decided to do. But that's not what happens with Gawain. Lord Bertilak not only doesn't invite him, he makes a very odd deal with him. He tells him, "You're tired from your journey, and you shall stay in your bed and lie at your ease, and then go dine with my wife." That's on page 316. So the men go hunting, and the women stay in bed because hunting in the Middle Ages as today is something that happens really you start out right before dawn, and the women could lie in bed and not shoot bows and arrows or stab things. But here is the thing that is the shadiest. Also, the most intriguing. Lord Bertilak makes the strangest covenant with Sir Gawain. Now, I have a discussion of covenant and exchanges in another video that's already up on Moodle, and I suggest you watch that as a companion to this to talk about the Christian implications of the exchanges in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. But this is what Lord Bertilak says: whatsoever I win in the wood shall be yours, and whatever fortune you win, exchange it with me for that. My translation, this text appears on 316 in the Middle English. I have tweaked it ever so slightly because I actually think that it's a less accurate translation of a critical passage for our understanding. It uses the word misfortune, but it really is talking about what I hunt, I give to you, and what you hunt up, you give to me, more or less. So what the heck is that about? One thing that we can know is that at this time, if you were going to talk about sex, you might use hunting metaphors. There's a word that Chaucer uses at the same time this is written, venery. And venery could just totally mean I'm after venison. And then it could also mean that you're chasing human interaction. I'll put it that way. Uh, both of these things had hunting metaphors, and men will still sometimes talk about the thrill of the chase and pursuing the woman they love and trying to convince her to love him back. But here, what they're talking about is when you say venery, you really, really don't mean the truest Christian expression of love headed for marriage. So, what a weird thing for the Lord Bertilak to suggest. I'll go hunting outside. Basically, you'll go hunting inside. I give to you what I catch. You give to me what you catch. That's really weird. So, but why, I asked, does Gawain get left with the ladies instead of going hunting with the men? Why does Lord Bertilak suggest an exchange of dead animals? For what? What could Gawain possibly get? What is he going to give? Um, that given what the metaphor suggests, what is he supposed to do? And if Gawain ends up next to a beautiful woman alone, which he does, spoiler alert, and he succumbs to temptation, which he doesn't to the full extent. It's not like he has sex with the woman in bed with him, who, again, spoiler alert, is Lady Bertilak, Lord Bertilak's wife. What's he supposed to do in this exchange moment? Because here's how Lord Bertilak has set it up. Gawain ends up in front of Lord Bertilak's retinue. This is how Lord Bertilak sets it up. And he gets everybody's looking around. And so Bertilak says, Gawain, we made a deal. Here is the stag I slew. It is yours, sir. And then Gawain gives him a kiss. Because he says, well, who was it? Who was it you got it from? And he says, that wasn't part of the bargain. I wasn't going to tell you. But let's just take it to the logical conclusion that seems to have been the purpose of the encounter. What if he had succumbed fully to the temptation of sleeping with Lady Bertilak, who literally gets in bed with him, and the men aren't around? And let's say he has sex with her. What does he give to Lord Bertilak? Here's the stag I gave you. Oh, well, let me give you what I gave you. What does he do? I mean, I don't wish to be overly vulgar, but does he pull down his tights and bend over? Because there's another point where he doesn't pull down his tights, but he does bend over at the end of this text. And I wonder if this isn't some kind of foreshadowing and mockery of that, but also, what is he offering in exchange for the dead deer? Some scholars think that Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a commentary on the court of King Edward III. Edward III was very good in battle. And his son, the Black Prince he was known as, not for the color of his skin, but the color of his armor, was probably the greatest warrior of his generation. Very, very impressive guy on the battlefield. He dies ultimately before he can accede to the throne. But King Edward III is kind of more like a party king. And he's very, very good at parties. He glories in the stories of war, but they're symbolic in his castle. King Edward had his knights throw many Arthurian court celebrations, balls, and jousts. When I say Arthurian, I don't just mean they were, vaguely like what you see in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I mean, they said, let's disguise ourselves as if we were British history. I will dress up as King Arthur, says King Edward III, and you will dress like the Knights of the Round Table. I have another video about Arthurian legends and their power politically and culturally in the Middle Ages. This comment is a companion to that video. You might want to review it. And King Edward is so fascinated with this, he starts his own Arthurian knight order called the Knights of the Garter. But he also has these jousts. This That this is written in French should not astonish you. It could entirely be English based on what you've already seen in another video about the history of the English language. And people have balls and jousts, and again, these are exceedingly expensive. And the warfare is largely play acting. It doesn't work like real warfare because nobody is supposed to die. They're just supposed to prove who's the strongest, like in WWF fighting. And he changed the dubbing of his knight ceremony to harken back to the court of King Arthur, at least as he understood it. The dubbing ceremony is adopted from a French tradition called adoubement, where they there's a version of it that still exists where people kneel before the monarch and the monarch has a sword and taps both shoulders of the person about to become a knight and then says, "Arise, sir," whatever the name of the person is. Or you can also get knighted today as a dame, and you can be, "Arise, Dame Edith." And so that still continues. What you're hearing is my husband playing with our new dog. But his military, for all the jousting under the court of King Edward, there are so many jousting tournaments, the military couldn't secure victory during the 100 Years' War, even though during his time, the English both invent and perfect the longbow, which is the first really longer range weapon in warfare in Europe, and consequently very, very important. And they do win an important battle where they actually kidnap the French king and bring him back to England. But that by itself is not enough to secure the end of the war, in particular because the king doesn't want to go back and be the king anymore. He has way more fun at the parties of the English court. And he really doesn't want to go back. He stays 10 years. And thus, some people in the country suggested that the knights and warriors of King Edward III were too decadent and insufficiently masculine to win. Something to note is that I'm sorry, my dogs are barking. Something to note is that on both sides of the 100 Years' War, the French and the English, both sides are secretly saying, hey, why can't our knights win? Are they just not man enough? That's a real insecurity on both sides of the English Channel. And then some suggest that Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is making reference to the Templar Knights. Now, the Templar Knights were held in the highest esteem when they were fighting the Crusades. They took Jerusalem for the Pope. They were literally considered priestly knights. They were holy knights. They were working for the Pope, taking over the city of Jerusalem, which was in the hands of a group that was both mixed of Turkish people and Arab people who were Muslim, called the Saracens. But then they lose Jerusalem at the beginning of the 1300s. And since God was surely on the side of the European occupation of Jerusalem, how could he not be, according to the thinking of the Middle Ages in Europe? Well, then there must have been sin among the Templar Knights. Hence, when the Templar Knights lost Jerusalem to the Saracens, the King of France accused them of losing it because they were committing acts of witchcraft and sodomy. So they were gay witches, burnt at the stake. And the King of France burned them for being proto-queer witches. They were burnt at the stake, and consequently, it was important that they not just be imprisoned or executed as prisoners of war or something like that. They had to be burned for witchcraft because that allowed the king to confiscate all their money. The Templars were effectively the bankers for the royal families of Europe, and now all that money belonged to the King of France. But then he suddenly died, and hence began the the struggle for power, and there was a vacuum, and one of the contenders made the one who was most directly related to the throne of France was the King of England, and hence they had a war for 100 years about it. Another thing that this might be a reference to is the Knights of the Garter, the Arthurian style order of knights that were invented by Edward III, and they still exist in England. They are still actually the highest order of knights, and this is their crest of arms with their slogan in the picture. And the very last page of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight has this phrase in French, "Honni soit qui mal y pense," which means "Cursed be he who thinks ill of this." This is the motto of the Knights of the Garter. It may have been added after the Gawain poet by another writer who had the manuscript in his possession. That was not an unusual event in the Middle Ages. And when that ever happened, it's called a scribal intervention. People didn't think of authorship in the way that they do now. If you didn't like the ending of the book that was in your possession, well, goodness, it was your book. You could change the ending. Whatever you may think, the reference is like, why is it that we have this exchange? Why do we have some of the odd things that happen related to masculinity and knighthood in this story? Let's acknowledge that the suggestion of Lord Bertilak for a covenant is surprising. What he thinks would be a good covenant is very surprising, and it's maybe meant thoroughly in humor, but it's also naughty. It's indecent. I hope to see you next time. Don't worry, you haven't been exposed to COVID-19. Um, I don't have COVID symptoms, but I am too dizzy to get in a car and drive to Hammond. It is a problem. So that is why I am sending you this from home. I apologize for the barking dogs and my husband playing with the dogs in the background.